All right, Matt. I know we talked a little bit before, but still, can you introduce you a little bit for the audience?
Yeah, my name is Matt Price. I'm the Director of Strength and Performance Science with the LA Kings hockey team. In my 12th year now. Uh, I'm a hockey guy by sort of trade, grew up in the Toronto area in Canada, played hockey most of my life. Um, but there was a time where when I went to grad school, I was out in Calgary in Western Canada, and um, the 2010 Olympics were coming when I was in grad school, and was fortunate enough to get a job in alpine ski racing. So took a bit of a detour out of the sport that I'm most familiar with, and spent 7 years and two Olympics in ski racing before I came back to hockey and started working in LA. So sort of a primarily a hockey background, but I feel fortunate to have spent some time in other sports and gained a perspective from what other sports deal with. Learning the differences and similarities between those things was really valuable for me. So yeah, no, just like I said, 12 years in LA, and uh, just a great organization, and it's been a long journey of learning and growing and developing. Always been really supported well to explore new ideas and look for things that we can do better. So it's been a very fruitful relationship, hopefully for both sides. But I know for me, I've gained a lot.
Nice. Do you think do you think that like in the last 10 years we have like more and more access to like technology? Do you think that kind of change how you program training or how you view like training?
Yeah, I mean, clearly there's been an explosion of technology. You know, whether that's I mean, force plates are probably one of the most obvious ones. I think VBT technologies have been around for a while, but are such there's just more options now. There's everything from very expensive options to very cheap options. But I think technology, probably the technology that's impacted me the most. And full disclosure, I work with the company now is 1080 Motion. And when I first started working with 1080 equipment, probably 11 years ago now, we were one of the first adopters of their systems. Was really to explore the use of eccentric work and to have a safe tool to apply eccentrics to athletes. But to be quite honest, and I've been pretty vocal about this, was the use of isokinetics. And I think that technology in a format that was quote unquote more athletic, we had access to more movements and movement patterns than maybe a traditional isokinetic knee dynamometer or something that was isolated to single joint. Um, and so, a technology like that had a huge impact on my programming. First and foremost, we were able to apply really high intensity loading to athletes in a really safe manner. And given the schedule of an NHL team, we're playing at a high frequency, right? We play 82 games in 180 days, so almost every other day. And what it did, what is it shifted the programming away from looking for days where you could fit in uh, bigger volume sessions, and allowed me to adopt more of a microdosing strategy where we could apply high intensity uh, loading in very specific ways, at a higher daily frequency, so multiple times per week without creating any fatigue, and actually um, and the outcome was athletes, and we had many athletes were getting stronger in the season, which is sort of counter to what most of us would think is possible, especially with such a heavy competition schedule. So, I think technology has been generally positive, right? I think there's probably many cases where we've experienced or come across a technology that didn't make our lives easier, and that's really the purpose of these things. But to me, of all the diagnostic tools, the training tool that 1080 created and has become so popular for was probably the most impactful.
Hmm. So Uh, Talk to me about like how you guys use 1080. Is it just the 1080 sprint or you guys have other 1080 equipment?
Yeah. So I'm a 1080 fanboy, right? Like we were one of the first gyms in North America to have the synchro system. We were one of the first gyms with the original sprint unit. First or second units ever shipped into North America. So we were really early adopters. And obviously, the sprint was applied mostly in sprinting exercises and testing, and we used that on the ice with our skaters. But the synchro unit, which was twin towers with a Smith machine attached, that was like a really uh, sort of a cool time where we started to experiment a lot with different exercises and movements and ways to load and to overload eccentrically or like I said apply isokinetics. And so we actually ended up adding a second system. So not long after we ended up with two synchro systems, which is four quantums if you're familiar with their equipment. And they recently came out with the 1080 cable, which is an amazing piece of engineering. It's a very compact unit if you've seen those. And we added four more of those units. So between our two training centers, we have our primary training and practice facility, and then our game facility, uh, which is a smaller gym. Uh, we have 10 units. We use two different sprints. We have four quantums and uh, four of the cable units. So really, we're using them in a lot of different ways. So again, a lot of the strength and power training, the primary lifts or primary movements are used on 1080 because we can manipulate the loading so well. We can obviously overload eccentrically isokinetics, like I've already talked about, or we may do concentric only work, which is a really great thing to have at your disposal, especially in season when we're trying to minimize any muscle soreness or tissue damage from eccentric loading. So again, it just gives us so many options that's probably the thing that we're using the most are those cables and quantums. But um, to be quite honest, the Sprint unit and their new 2.0 Sprint, which is a very small mobile unit, has become even more versatile in our programming. It's been used in the rehab setting, and then it was a travel system for us now. So we're able to travel with our Sprint 2 and apply that for different use cases with athletes that had been using it in rehab and need to use that in pregame prep or in ongoing therapeutic uses. We can have that with us pretty much at all times. So yeah, they're just heavily used equipment. You know, the data is great. It's not necessarily why we're using it. It's more about the versatility and the ability for the coaching staff to sort of dial in exactly how we want to load the athlete.
Hmm. So, uh, I'm pretty familiar with 1080 sprint, but talk to me about how you use the quantum and or how you use what's the squat called? The 10 the Smith machine called.
Yeah, the Smith is the quantum, so it's two quantums attached with a Smith. And so they can be used separately or together in what they call synchro mode. Um, yeah, I mean those are, I mean they're super powerful tools. They have a ton of capacity, either as standalone or together. Um, I think there's very obvious ways to use them, right? It's basically a pulley, right? And any exercise that you would traditionally use a cable stack, a Kaiser, any of these types of exercises, you supercharge them on a 1080. You can, like I said, you can get very precise with the way you load. Um, and like I said, oftentimes we will take eccentric loading out of an exercise in season, or if there's an opportunity to really um, get into serious strength training in season, perhaps there's a player who's coming back from an injury and we want to, we have some time that we can do some more advanced loading. We might actually do some eccentric overload, which is a super valuable way to whether it's hypertrophy training or strength training. But I think there's also some unique uh, characteristics of a synchro. So if we again just reminding you that the synchro is the two systems combined with a Smith machine. Smith machines aren't probably the most popular piece of training equipment in a team environment or in a sports setting, right? Like that's something you would likely see at a 24-hour fitness or your community gym. But what it does is actually, we can use that in creative ways. So we've used the Smith in rehab settings where the thing that we don't like for healthy athletes is the stability and predictability of the Smith. We actually lean into that in a rehab situation. So, for example, we do have a lot of foot injuries, typically broken feet. We'll get a lot of MCL injuries, these types of things. So we can actually then train the healthy limb in a really stable way in a Smith machine. We can do step ups, we can do single leg RDLs, we can do uh, kneeling hip extensions. So we can do some very kind of, not necessarily exciting exercises, but we can use something that's a little bit more traditional in a rehab setting because we have the stability and predictability of a Smith machine. So again, just looking at something in a different perspective has allowed us to use that to our advantage. So again, just very very cool equipment that has a lot of different applications for a lot of different situations.
Hmm. So, so since you guys use 1080, like, how do you use 1080 sprint on the ice? Because, like, I never really only trained one or two hockey player when I was in Taiwan. But like, well, since I got to the state, like, I only use 1080 sprint to train mainly track athletes or football players. So talk to me about how you use 1080 sprint on the ice, because the way they sprint on the ice is different than the way they sprint on track. Yeah, right.
Or is it, right? So I might ask you, how would you use it to train a basketball player or a football athlete, right? And I'm going to assume, because I don't train basketball players or football athletes, um, but the way you're going to use the sprint is probably in some linear acceleration or linear uh, full upright sprinting, right? And maybe you've used it as an overspeed tool. Um, it's no different on ice, right? So I think human locomotion's fairly general in a sense, right? So skating looks super unique. It is unique, but there's still characteristics that are more or less the same as terrestrial land-based sprinting. So the way we would use the tool is, and it was used a long time as our primary sprint testing tool. And we've since migrated to some different technology and methodologies. But the sprint is an excellent diagnostic tool. So having athletes sprint in a very lightly loaded condition and over a defined distance. And for us, they generally are shorter distances. I like 20 meters as an assessment distance. Um, but we'll test with it, but it becomes our go-to training tool. And I can say that there's two reasons why I want to load an athlete, and we load at the hip like everybody else would. But first and foremost, where we've identified that an athlete still requires more power, right? So the ability to produce horizontal power uh, is a critical ability to move forward. So loading them on the ice and having them do the thing that they do best, which is skate, it's a very very good training application. Um,
Mm.
Hockey players are generally pretty poor runners. Um, And so we want to, as often as possible, train them sprinting with the sprint on the ice, doing the thing that they do best in the environment that they know best. So obvious application is power training, right? We're gonna power train on the ice, and sometimes we frame it that way with athletes that we're not teaching them to skate, that we're doing power training on the ice, and that seems to change the perspective and the way athletes look at that type of a training session. The other thing is that lightly loading the athlete at the hip is also an excellent constraint. And so when we quote unquote test our athletes in a linear sprint, we use video analysis, and we often find athletes that are too upright, too vertical in their acceleration. So they're producing very little horizontal power, and are putting a lot of vertical force into the ice. And so by applying that resistance at the waist, and we'll use lighter loads in this condition, but we find that tactile feel around the waist allows them to move forward, get their trunks into better positions, and allow them to uh, push into a more horizontal position, which is an excellent constraint tool. So there's sort of the two primary applications there, as a power tool or as a constraint.
Hmm. So another question is like, do you guys use 1080 sprint to change the direction and deceleration? And do you use it in season or off season? Or is it like you said, it's like a microdosing in the season?
Yeah, so there's some um, there's some unique things about skating and hockey that make those types of applications a little more tricky. The first big obvious thing is that they hold a hockey stick. And when you try to change direction with a tool like the 1080 Sprint, uh, you end up with a stick that can get caught in the line, right? That line has to move freely around the waist. And unfortunately, it's a challenging setup for a hockey player to use the sprint as a change of direction tool on the ice. Um, and uh, but it's still valuable off the ice. I think there's times early in our preparation period in the off season where we can use the sprint in the gym as a change of direction tool, where they're not necessarily trying to run in a let's call it a technically proficient way, that we're moving in very small distances, and we can use that as an overload or overspeed tool. So having that kind of resistance assistance type of a setting is a good thing for us, particularly with hockey. It's a rare condition where a hockey player will be moving in a linear direction, stop, and then change direction exactly in the opposite direction. So there's a lot of sort of curvilinear type of motion. There's gliding, right? On skates, we can glide. So instead of standing still and assessing the situation, players are kind of always in motion, constantly moving, and so they tend to accelerate out of turns. And so from a ecological validity standpoint, or looking at the specific context of the sport, the sprint is a little bit limited for us, if we are trying to move to something that is a little bit more contextual for change of direction in hockey. Now, if we're just looking at the capacity of the ability to decelerate the body and reaccelerate in the opposite direction, it's a fantastic tool, and we still will look at training that in the off season. Again, it's understanding the context of how those things apply, where the capacity is being built, and then for me, it's always about leading it back to the ice, right? So you working with basketball players, there's probably some elements of this happening in the gym, but you're likely building towards on court drills or on court types of exercises where you're going to have them move in more specific patterns. And that's no different than us. It's just that we have some unique characteristics that we have to be sort of aware of when we get on the ice, as to what can and can't be done, and what the real context of acceleration in a game is, and what happens most often.
Mm. And since like I mean hockey is a little bit different than land-based sport like football or basketball, especially like they wear is it called hockey skates?
Yeah.
Right? So I'm assuming because I don't know, I'm assuming like they don't have that much of range of motion like football player on in their ankle like football or basketball player. So does that mean like they're probably gonna compensate more on the knee or hip? And is that like what you used to see? And what type of injury what are some common injury you have to deal with?
Yeah, and I think just to touch on the first point around the ankle, I think there's more range of motion at the ankle than people assume. And the reason is that there's a lot of force going through that hockey skate, through the boot. The boot is very stiff, but they do have they are able to achieve range of motion. Now, all athletes are different, and the way that they lace the skate, how tight, and where they prefer to have that tightness and restriction, obviously can affect how much the ankle actually moves. But to your point, it's not as free as it would be out of a skate. And of course, their bodies need to move through certain ranges, and the most likely area that there's going to be compensation or overuse is up the chain, and it happens to be around the hip primarily. So we don't end up with a lot of non-contact injuries around the knee. Those are more contact traumatic type situations. Where we do have a lot of issues is in the adductors. So adductor hip flexor more on the medial and anterior side of the hip, where or sprinters are commonly having hamstring issues. The adductor muscle group is where hockey players tend to have the non-contact soft tissue injuries that are a result of uh, either poor skating mechanics, poor ice conditions, or something that went wrong in a stride. It happens, but the failure tends to happen in the adductor region most commonly at length. So as they extend the hip, and that adductor group is in full length, and so are the muscles of the hip flexion. When they transition to shortening, there tends to be most of the soft tissue injuries in that area. Now, to be honest, I think the sport itself has learned a lot about those mechanisms, and have addressed hip mobility, hip strength in a really, I would say, in a profound way. I think uh, the community of professionals that works with ice hockey players, with the people that work within the professional teams, have really collectively figured out how to minimize those types of injuries. I know as a player, when I played in the 90s, it was common to, like, I would have one of those injuries every couple of weeks. We didn't know how to warm up. We didn't train correctly. Uh, we didn't do our mobility exercises. We didn't have anything specific around that. And you can see across a 35 year period of time where the impact of the performance specialist type people have been able to really minimize the incidence of soft tissue injuries, particularly non-contact. So they happen at a pretty low frequency now. But that's probably the biggest area that we're concerned with, because it's the one that we can impact the most. So again, every sport has a list of common injuries. Of ours, like I said, the groin injuries, the hip flexor type injuries are the ones that we're probably most sensitive to, because we feel like that's the one that we personally have the biggest impact on.
Cool. That's actually interesting because outside because I know like groin and adductor type injuries all like I mean hockey players always have to deal with that, but I thought ACL will ACL will also be on like a list of common injury.
Yeah, when we talk about lower body, ACLs happen for sure. They're not super common. Like if you look at like the NFL has a epidemic of ACL injuries, I know that there's you can follow Twitter accounts that are documenting these and giving you the daily or weekly tally. Um, I would say, and this is just off the top of my head, but I bet you in the NHL there are five or less per year. And that's 800-ish players playing 82 games. That's a lot of man games of exposure where the incidents of an ACL are pretty rare. And I would guess that 100% of those two, three, four, five ACL injuries are in a pretty uh, catastrophic contact fashion. There's something happening where players have fallen at high rates of speed or have collided into boards and legs have gotten tangled, and it's caused a pretty traumatic knee injury. Whereas if you look at a lot of NFL film or basketball film, a player simply cuts the wrong way or plants a leg and you see an ACL rupture. So for our sport, ACLs not so much. We do see a lot of MCL, probably more MCL, and that's again generally through contact. Like it's a full contact sport. People are crashing into each other, into boards, into nets. There's a lot of opportunity for trauma to happen. So MCL definitely much more common than ACL. Um, and then we have the other types of injuries that again probably just fall outside of our ability to really impact, which is fractures, broken bones of the feet, hands, concussions, shoulder injuries. So we do end up with a lot of AC joint sprains, probably more common than a subluxation or a dislocation. But the shoulder definitely takes a beating, and then you're probably looking at commonly through whether it's related to the adductors, but a lot of core muscle strains as well. A lot of sports hernia, or maybe more isolated at the oblique type of thing where there's been some strain or trauma due to shooting, or again maybe something where there was some high force put through the trunk that was unanticipated.
Hmm. And so if we're talking about like anterior or medial part of the hip, like usually how would you deal with it?
How would they injure that area?
No, how would you deal with those type of injury?
Yeah. Listen, it starts off with really good baseline screening, right? Like there's some good literature about what would cause a flag in terms of adductor abduction strength ratios. And I think the tools like I guess the common one, the groin bar or force frame or these types of things, they give you a good high level understanding of where the force generation capacity is within those muscle groups. Um, so literature, says that you should have somewhere around 70 to 80% adduction to abduction. Um, I would say that in my experience, more than 90% of our players are producing upwards of 120% in adduction. The adductor groups are extremely strong. And that's not just relative. When we look at the absolute values, they have very strong abduction. Their glutes are extremely strong because their hips are externally rotating and extending. So that muscle group is really, really strong to begin with. The adductors are commonly 110, 120% of that, which is a really interesting thing in itself. That sport produces very strong hip musculature. Now, occasionally we'll find someone that is under a 1-to-1 ratio. So they might be 80% or 90%. And to us, that's a flag. So by the literature, that shouldn't be a flag, but to us it is. So we'll start with that assessment. At least we understand where someone is in terms of baseline. If and when a groin injury happens, uh, typically, they're going to run through a series of people in the system and the sort of protocol to get them back to play. And so, a lot of the early rehab done with our physiotherapists and our athletic trainers, they're doing various modalities in, in terms of the different things they can do to get blood flow in the area. Low level exercises tend to do more core strengthening, looking at things that support the hip. And as the groin heals and gets stronger, they'll go into a clearance process. So we want to see them be able to, for example, we use two things that are kind of cool, but we'll use the skier's edge, which is a tool that alpine skiing uh, has at its disposal, but it's simply just a lateral pushing tool, back and forth, back and forth. And then we'll actually get them onto a slide board. And slide boards are kind of another tool that was popularized in ice hockey, but I think other sports probably use more than we do. But it's an excellent tool to address adductor strength. And the reason is the way you push on a slide board after you extend and push, and you're moving, for example, moving to your left, the right leg, which is trailing, is in an extended position and has an isometric force applied to the adductor. And so as you're pushing, you have this sort of back and forth loading of the groins. And we want to see, is that something that they can do, A, pain free, and B, can they tolerate some reasonable level of volume of work there. And once we're confident that they can handle some of these off ice activities, and they've been cleared to skate, then we go through a pretty rigorous on ice return to play program. Um, Typically with a legitimate groin strain, we're talking something grade 2, grade 3, that's kept them out for generally 3 or 4 weeks of play. The on ice return to play is an extension of the off ice PT. So we treat it like we're doing PT on ice, and we use a pretty strategic method of long course skating. So we have a hockey rink that uh, is 100 feet wide by 200 feet long, and so there's this sort of constrained space that you can move within, and we'll work them through what we call long skating. Okay, and then we'll go into medium type patterns where the turns become a little bit smaller, and then we'll shrink that down into smaller turns. The reason we use that is the forces that are expressed through the hip get greater as the turns get smaller, right? So we're managing the angular velocities, we're managing the force that the hip has to produce to stabilize, and how much force is put through the hip when they're skating. So we'll work through those progressions over multiple days, building volume first, and then we start to layer in intensity. So we're going to look at different versions of acceleration, which obviously has a lot of force, and we'll introduce stop and start. Again, an athlete in hockey can stop and sprint the other way. That's another high force maneuver. We'll build in high velocity skating. So with player tracking technology, which we use on ice, we can be very strategic with how we progressively overload, which types of elements we introduce, um, and always checking that the tissue is healing and responding day over day. And again, leading them to a point where then we bring them back to some skill development and skill reacquisition, so that we can integrate them into a practice essentially restriction free, and then get them back to playing. So it's a pretty thorough process, to be quite honest, maybe more thorough than common. But over 10 to 12 years, we've found this process to be highly successful. We've also found it to be not just successful in getting them back, but keeping them back. So we have a very, very low incidence of reoccurring injury. So I guess we could say we're over baking them in the front end, and then getting a better product when they're back to playing.
Hmm. So, a question following to that is like, since you mentioned like they're actually pretty strong in terms of like their adductor strength and abductor strength, do you see that like usually the guys get groin injury? Is it because are they really like weaker than others?
It's not one of these perfect correlation type of scenarios, right? So oftentimes, again, we're talking about an incidence of injury that now is I bet you for most teams, and these aren't disclosed injuries, so I can only speak to our experience, but I bet you have uh, you're going to have more than zero and probably less than five of these types of injuries in a year, which is pretty remarkable. Again, going back 20, 30 years ago, you would have dozens of these types of injuries. So we have a low incidence, and the ones that get hurt aren't always the ones that were necessarily flagged as having a strength deficit. The hard part about our sport is that sometimes bad things happen. Um, and we can sometimes narrow down likely causes, right? So we'll say there's sort of this no known mechanism. They simply took a push and the tissue failed. Um, Now we can look at things like what was their acute chronic workload ratio. So oftentimes coming out of periods where we haven't skated, we come out of a Christmas break or an all-star break, we often see more tissue soreness. We see muscle soreness, we see hip pain, not necessarily injuries, but we see things that are starting to bubble to the surface that might become injuries. We often see this early in the season where training camps are heavy and hard, and we're skating much more than normal. So we know that the times where these things are likely to happen. Um, Another thing that we have in our sport is that ice conditions can vary, right? So to the average hockey fan, or even to someone who doesn't really follow the sport, you see a hockey rink, they all look the same. There's frozen water, there's ice. Okay, it's all the same. It's not. Um, Temperatures and humidities can affect how much that ice, how hard it can be. So, for example, poor ice conditions, we would call poor ice conditions are soft. Where the skate, because they have a sharp skate, that skate becomes more aggressive. It interacts with the ice in a more aggressive way and can change what sort of forces are being transmitted up through the chain. So sometimes in soft ice conditions, we get more groin pain. So, for example, in Los Angeles, we share our game arena with the LA Lakers. And actually, we had the LA Clippers there for a long time. So we have two basketball teams and a hockey team. And you can imagine that that means the ice is actually being covered by a basketball court a lot. I can tell you that having a basketball court on top of a hockey rink isn't good for the ice conditions. It makes for very soft ice. And so it's not uncommon for us to have groin issues or soreness, at least, not necessarily injury, but soreness because of the ice conditions. Not only does soft ice lead to groin soreness or a higher frequency of reported soreness, ice can fail, right? So a guy can take a very forceful push into the ice. You got big guys, 220, 230 pounds. They can push in the ice can break. Now, that's not common, but ice failure can then lead to an extremely high velocity lengthening under tension because it fails when they're not expecting, and you can end up with tissue issues there as well. So I think there's a number of factors that go into uh, why an injury happens, and it's unfortunately it's not always as easy to say that athlete was weak and then they had an injury. We have to consider a lot of different factors that go into it. A lot of them are environmental.
Nice, nice. I love it. So, all right, last part of this podcast. You work with LA Kings for like last decades, right?
Yeah.
And so you probably need to go through a lot of like interview with hiring people, hiring like your assistants, right? So, uh, and I also go through a lot of interview like before I get hired. So I guess my question is like when you're when a job like when a position is open, like and like the team's looking to hire someone, like what are some like characteristics or like what are some like is there like certain type of skill set you're looking for or like I don't know.
Yeah, no, I understand what you're asking, and just to give you a quick history, like when I was hired 12 years ago, the there was just me as a strength coach, right? So the strength coach was the dietitian, was the sports scientist, was the strength coach, and you're kind of overseeing the NHL team, the our minor league team, which is an AHL team. We've got prospects. We've got so you get spread pretty thin, and been fortunate over the years where the team has invested in growing the staff, diversifying the staff, building out what I would say is a more traditional, modern performance department. So, now we have staff that are specifically tasked with nutrition. So we have two dietitians on our staff. We have three strength coaches. Sports science is still an area that I manage more closely, but we certainly amongst the staff would delegate out different responsibilities so other people have hands-on sports science. I think sports science sometimes is hard to completely separate from strength conditioning, right? So a lot of uh, younger strength coaches have come up through education systems where they're very much one and the same. Um, so, to come back to your question around hiring, now most of the hires I've made over the years have typically fit a profile which is well educated, right? So generally a master's degree, a certification in whatever their field is. So obviously, a strength coach would have a CSCS, a dietitian would have an RD designation, and they tend to be and then have some experience in the field, right? We don't want someone with zero coaching experience. We want some experience at a high level, but not so much that they're set in their ways, right? So I guess there's a philosophical approach that I've developed here, and I want people to come in that have certainly their own experiences and ideas, so that they can help us grow and evolve, but also are open to new ideas and learning the ways that we figured out have worked generally well for us. So those people tend to be, I would just say, around 30 years old. Um, and to be fair, they're most often they're assistant type roles, so they're not senior type leadership roles. So they fit that profile. But when we come back to personality characteristics, for me, um, I think an important one. I mean, you have to be hardworking. You've worked in pro sports. You know that the hours are long. Everybody's overworked and underpaid. So you have to have a passion for what you're doing. I think you get involved in team sports because you probably want to win. Winning championships matters. You can't win a championship working at a local performance gym. So there's a reason why you're with a team, and that should be first and foremost. Is our goal is to do all of the things necessary to help the team win championships. But as it comes down to the practitioner, I really enjoy working around people that have a curiosity, that want to understand things, that are creative, that are constantly looking for new solutions. And so I've spoken about this in the past, but as a performance staff member, or I guess for any support staff for that matter, uh, we don't pick rosters and players and coach the team. Like winning is hard for us because we're not front and center. We're not in the field of play, and I think you have to redefine what winning means, because it doesn't matter which league or sport you work within. There's usually one winner, right? Which means there's a lot of losers by definition. But I think if we look at different ways to win, for me, that's continual growth, continual evolution, um, continually scrutinizing the way we do things and how can we do things better. And these systems have to be flexible, right? They have to be dynamic. What worked 3 or 4 years ago, our roster is almost completely different than it was 3 or 4 years ago. There's different personality types. There's different expectations, and so we have to continually be fluid with some of these things. So, I think as a staff member, you have to be prepared to constantly evolve and grow and be willing to try new things to see if it works. I come back to is um, and I'll probably mess this quote up, but John Wooden's quote of you haven't taught until they've learned. And the reason I bring that up is if we continually use the same methods, the same approach, and the same overall program, and we have athletes that aren't responding or are maybe not enjoying it, um, that comes back to the coaches on the coach to a degree, which is you need to find a new way to connect with an athlete and get them to buy in, right? Like these are highly paid athletes. They're the best in the world at what they do. And our job is to get through to them and to support them and help them understand. So the staff that we bring in need to have those characteristics. It's not about being uh, the best practitioner in the world and being a one person show. It's about, can you collaborate with other staff? Can you communicate well? And can you continually evolve and grow and just be a generally a curious human?
Nice, nice. I love that. I love that. So, uh, that's all the question I have for you today. Appreciate you.
Cool. Thanks for having me. And yeah, it was fun to chat.